somewhere in your booklet, but obviously the first point I was trying to make is that the way you receive the gospel, the good news, is also the way you will believe it. And the way you believe it is how you will show that to others and how you will manifest it that way. I spoke also about the difference between mercy and grace. It's important to make that distinction, to understand the difference between the two, because if you meddle with these two, you come to a very different conclusion about the gospel. And finally, I explained a bit more about what righteousness really is. It is actually our new identity because of Jesus Christ. Knowing that, we're going now to the second part of the gospel series about the gospel. And I told you the gospel is good news, right? It's good news. But if there is good news, there is also bad news. Because if it's just news, that you cannot call it good or bad. It's just news. I will explain it a little bit more. I really need your good ear this sermon, because you might come to the conclusion like, oh, he's going now into a direction. I'm not sure if I'm liking this sermon that much. Now, obviously, this is part of a series. That means that when I talked about the good news and when I talk about the bad news, next week, when Janine is going to preach, unpacking it even a bit more, you will understand the sequence. If you just listen to this sermon, not knowing what happened last week and not having read the entire epistle, you might come to different conclusions. So please bear with me. Listen to the very end of it. This is one of those sermons that for a pastor, particularly in 2018, is not very good to preach. Topics like the wrath of God, the anger of God, hell, condemnation, judgment, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, and all of that other stuff. It appears all in some ways in Romans chapter 1 and chapter 2. Just imagine with which grace and which love I need to stand here to share this, obviously, with you. But let me first, before I do, share a story with you. As a teenager, you know that I didn't know the Lord for a long time. And when I got to know the Lord, things in my parents' home got out of hand really, really fast. It came even to the point that I went away from home. It's like, I cannot stay here anymore. And the one that actually welcomed me in was my grandmother. She passed away a few years ago. And it's interesting, when you are, for a few years, living with somebody that's much older than you, obviously the conversations are also very different. And as a person, I was 17, 18 years old. You mature really, really fast. You just have to. It's a reality. My grandmother back then was suffering cancer, was very sick, did chemos and everything. And I saw the whole situation with her going on, with her going to the restroom, having diarrhea, feeling really, really bad because of the radiation therapy that she also was doing. Sometimes the conversations that were at the table or sometimes in front of the TV, you know, when you watch the news on TV and then, you know, grandmother all of a sudden says, "Oh, my son, where is this world coming to these days?" You ever heard those comments sometimes that people can make? It's going from bad to worse. Yes, exactly. And people, they cannot stand each other anymore. And usually as a 17, 18-year-old, you listen to that and think like, well, it's not so bad. I mean, yeah, sure, you hear some things on TV. Like when you watch the news, it doesn't make you that super happy. But it's not that bad, is it? Sometimes the conversations were about politics. Now, you need to be careful, obviously, to talk about politics. Or about the fact that I wasn't living anymore with my parents. But sometimes the conversations were also about religion. She knew that recently I had come to the Lord, and she did notice some change here and there. And she saw that I was going to church with a friend of mine who introduced me to Christianity, to Jesus. But every time when I would talk to her about God, it was as if I was talking to a barrier. There was something in between. And she always came, it's like you're talking in circles. Do you know that story? Like you're talking to a person, and then after half an hour, you're back to square one again. It's like this is not going anywhere. That was the impression I had with my granny. And the reason for it was this. My grandmother, she was born before the Second World War in very poor circumstances. And when she started dating a Jewish man. This was right after the Second World War. Now, you can understand the whole sentiment towards Jews. That was a bit complicated. And to make matters worse, it was the 40s, more or less, still. My grandmother got pregnant. She wasn't married, but she got pregnant. Now, nowadays it's like, okay, what's the big deal? A lot of people don't make it a big deal anymore. But just imagine how it was in the 40s. Ooh, what was that? So her parents were looking at that like, what is this Jew doing here with you? They got married. They started living in Amsterdam, which was the capital city of Europe, basically of Jewish people, of the western part of Europe. A lot of Jews, after the Second World War, started living in Amsterdam, and they lived in absolute poverty. My mother got born, was in 48, and they were still, my grandmother was still raised in not in the Roman Catholic, in the Dutch Reformed tradition. So my great-grandmother, she's also not with us anymore, she used to be a Dutch Reformed person, would go to church every now and then, and that's really what she held on to till the end of her life. Now she saw that tradition, and for my grandmother it was a tradition, because she would go to church, everybody wearing black, women sitting on one side, men sitting on the other side, the preacher talking about hell and damnation, about condemnation, about all of the stuff that you think like, whoa. But back then, I wouldn't say it's normal, but that was pretty common. So she was already scarred by religion in that sense. On top of that, my grandmother wanted to baptize my mother, obviously. It was still in 48. That was part of the tradition. That's what you would do. But the problem was that my grandfather was a Jew. So for a reverend for the Dutch Reformed Church, it's like, oh, you're going to baptize this person and then raise them in the Christian faith. How can you do that? This man is a Jew. So he didn't allow it to happen. He's like, you're not going to get baptized, at least not in this church. What do you think the image of Christianity, of Christian people was for my grandmother back then? Quite negative, wasn't it? 7 years passed by, my uncle got born. That was 7 years later. And she said, like, you know what, I'm going to give it another shot. Different pastor, who knows? Maybe now we can, get both my son and my older daughter, my mom, baptized. She went again, same church, but the same problem again. Went up to the reverend, it's like, I would like to baptize my 2 children. And the reverend was looking and said, like, no, he's a Jew, I cannot do it. At which point my grandmother said, like, you know what? I am going to another church, or at least to another minister who is willing to administer the sacrament, because for me this is really important. She found somebody that was finally willing to baptize both my mom and my uncle on the same day. They differ 7 years of age, and that's what happened. Now with all that baggage, everything that happened, many years later, I came to live with my grandmother. Now do you think that when you start a conversation about church, or about religion, or about God, it's a happy conversation? What do you think? Not really, right? But still, my grandmother, it's very interesting. It's like, for her, this whole conversation about God and all of this was very difficult. It wasn't exactly that she did not believe in God. Maybe that was still a little bit there. But when she associated God with, everything that happened to her, she became very close. It's like, I'm not going there. This is a herd. You're not going there, Patrick. A lot of people have that feeling, that sentiment. Particularly the older generation. Not just the older generation, but that's what I sense also with my dad for many years. And he's also already in his late 70s. Now, why am I saying all of this? We were talking last week about the good news, which is the gospel, right? The good news. I'm going to read Romans 1, 16 and 17 one more time, just to recap what the good news is. And perhaps you can see it on the screen. If not, you can just listen to it. That's fine. It says this, where Paul writes the following. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. For the Jew first, and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Now this sounds really positive, upbeat, happy, something like, wow, yes. The just shall live by faith, I believe in Jesus, salvation, He will transform me, all of these things. Really, really great. But that's the good news. I already told you, when there is good news, there is also not so good news, bad news. And that's why when Paul continues to write, he starts in verse 18 with something that you think like, whoa, I didn't see that one coming. I thought it all was all about grace and about love and about heaven and about being with God and all of that stuff. Now all of a sudden he starts talking about the wrath of God, judgments, unrighteousness, etc., etc. What is this all about? You can even read a little bit further if you read in verse 19 and verse 20. But I'm going to read verse 18. There it goes. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. And you shouldn't be just thinking men, by the way. It's everybody. Who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them. For God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Still here, I'm going to tell you a story. Let's imagine that I will just apply it to me again. That's the safest way of telling the story, obviously. Imagine that I am sleeping. I am in my home, somewhere here in Perth, near the parsonage. And I am by myself. My family is in Brazil, and it's just me. Okay? Can you imagine the picture? All of a sudden, I hear something like a window screeching or something like that. It's like, hey, what is going on here? And I soon start to realize, wait a second, somebody's trying to break into my home. What is going on here? But I'm still a little bit, like, you know, when you're sleeping, you're not fully aware of what's going on around you. So you wake up, it's like, is this really going on? So all of a sudden you wake up, you put something on, and I was trying to take a peek, like, what is going on here? Is somebody trying to sneak into my house, trying to rob me or something? And as I try to get out of my sleeping room, all of a sudden I hear a big bang, and somebody that I could barely see his face hit me in the face with a baseball bat. Can you just imagine it? It's all me, so it's safe. It's not about you, it's about me, all right? I'm unconscious. I just saw his face a little bit. I'm unconscious, and for 2 days I'm in the hospital. Okay, you can imagine the scene, right? Now, after 2 days, you can imagine the way I look like, and I wake up, and my eyes are barely open, and I see the two lovely eyes of my mom that flew over from Holland all the way to Australia because she heard about the news. And she looks at me and says like, oh, son, I'm so glad you're back. I was so worried about you. But let me tell you one thing, and she whispers this in my ear. She says like this, hey, Patrick, they got him. They got him. It's like, and I was still a little bit like, you know, when you're not fully aware of what's going on around you, under the influence of painkillers and everything, it's like, what you mean they got him? Like, well, you know the burglar? The one that was trying to sneak into your home? He left his fingerprints all over the place, and they found who it was. You know who it was? And I was still, what you mean, who it was? Well, it turned out to be, I just spoke to the police, this was an ex-colleague of you from your work. I was like, no way. A couple of weeks passed by, and we are in courtroom. I'm a little bit better already. But still, you know, very upset about everything that happened. And I just found out from my mom that it was actually an ex-colleague that left his job under not so very nice circumstances. That is now on the accused bench, sitting there knowing that, you know, he's in trouble. And I'm expecting what? What do you think I'm expecting from the judge and the jury to do? I'm expecting justice, right? That's what I'm expecting. So I'm sitting there, it's like, okay, Judge, let's call him Judge Stevens. Judge Stevens, he's gonna, you know, he's gonna read the verdict of the jury, and it's gonna be Guilty as charged. Guilty. Judge Stevens he was handed by the clerk the verdict, and before he wants to read the verdict, he looks at the defendant and says, any last words, any more words? The man stands up, crying, totally in disarray, and says, oh, Judge Stevens, can I just share a few words? Like, well, I just gave you the chance, please do so. And so like, well, you know what? Yes, it's true. I hit this man. I feel so terrible about what I did. And I would never ever do that. In fact, they caught me right away because I'm an amateur. I don't even know how to do these things. But at home, there is no food on the table. I got fired. They let me go of my job. But you know what, Judge Stevens? I'm not like this. I'm not this. You know what? I do a lot of good stuff as well. I volunteer in a charity organization as well. And, I really take care of my kids. Are you now going to send me to prison? Just imagine you're Judge Stevens. End of the story. What would you do? You see, on the left side, you see me, still all bruised and scattered, waiting for justice to happen. And on the other side, you see someone that obviously feels sorry for what he did. Now, as a judge, being loving and at the same time being judged, what do? It's a great dilemma. It's a great dilemma that we have even about God. How can a loving God, how many times did you hear that one? How can a loving God send people to hell? I heard that story many times. What do you do with it? How do you reconcile even those two? Well, let's imagine we are in the courtroom again. And this time around, I am the prosecutor. Let's call me Prosecutor Paul. We have Judge Stevens still sitting somewhere here in the room. I'm not going to point out anyone here particularly. We have Judge Stevens still in the room, as in the first story. And we have the jury. Now, the jury are religious Jews. Those that had the law, they knew what God wanted. They were all familiar with it. And the defendants are what we just read in Romans 1, verse 18. The wrath of God, the anger of God, is revealed from heaven against whom? Against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. The defendants are those people that do not want to live with God or don't care about God. And in this case, he is referring particularly to the non-Jews, those that are not from the Jewish heritage. And he's saying these things. And as a real prosecutor, sometimes you watch those programs on TV, you see the prosecutor, he's making his stand, and he's like, whoa, I'm glad I'm not sitting in that courtroom because I wouldn't have the stomach to deal with that. And he starts to make his arguments. And he's saying to the judge, he's saying to the jury, and he's saying particularly to the defendants, you guys are guilty. You're guilty as charged. Because you knew about the revelation of God. You look around everything, you can see. You can see. When you walk in nature, when you look at the brain of a human being, or when you look at the DNA of a person, that the fingerprints of God are all over the place, and still you say, nah, I don't want to deal with anything with this God. I live my own life. God, can you just leave me alone? Or maybe even worse, there is no God. And you just flat out deny it. You see, what Paul is saying here, and if you read it together with me, if we continue in verse 21, because although they knew God, and we're talking about the ungodly and the unrighteous people, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like footed animals and creeping things. The problem is, when you kick God out of a country or out of your heart or out of your system, it will be replaced by something else. There's just no other way. If we are created in His image and He knows how we should function, and if we kind of like, it's like a car. You know that you should be putting, 91 liter fuel in, and instead of that you put diesel in and still hope that your car will continue to run. You're going to have a problem. It's not going to run anymore. It's not going to work anymore. Well, basically Paul, in very different wording, he is saying this like this. He's like, listen, you want to do it your way? Just as Adam and Eve thought, like, well, we eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and we still come good out of it. It's a problem. And the problem with it is that when you kick God out of your system, out of your legal system, out of your country, out of your laws, out of everything, it will have to be replaced by something else. And obviously that something else becomes human beings themselves. Instead of having God as their reference for what is right and what is wrong, they themselves start to determine, well, I think this is right. I think it's fine. Sometimes you even have programs on TV that are encouraging people to cheat on each other, and people are just watching like, oh yeah, great. Isn't that wonderful? Idolatry. What is idolatry? Idolatry is nothing less than replacing your relationship with God for something else. Can be anything. Can be anything. And it is a very small step if you replace God with something or somebody else, idolatry, and you become your own judge in that sense. You determine what is right and what is wrong. That you go into, you will have a kind of like a reference that can become skewed really fast. That can become very problematic really, really fast. And it goes from idolatry very fast into immorality. You see sometimes videos on YouTube where people are being asked, like, do you think it's okay to sleep with your sister? There are a couple of videos. I can show them to you. And then because the evangelist is coming up and it's like, if you are the person that can, determine for yourself what is right and what is wrong, that means that nobody can say anything to you, right? Because you're your own judge. What you will often hear is this, who are you to judge? Why are you saying that to me? I will determine that for myself. But then it comes. Okay, let's suppose that you're sleeping with your sister. And now it's like, yeah, wait a second. That's wrong. You cannot do that. And it's like, well, didn't you just say that nobody can tell you what to do? Where does it end? Where does it go? Where is the end of the line? You understand where it's going? So from idolatry, replacing God for something or someone else, it goes very fast already to, oh, well, I can determine for myself. And just look around what's happening in Australia, in Europe, all over the world. That's exactly what's happening. Let me just give you two very simple examples. Very simple ones. Who likes cricket here in the room? Not me. Okay. Well, we knew about the scandal that just happened just a few weeks ago, right? Oh, it was all over the news, even in Holland. Holland has nothing with cricket, but it was on the news even in Holland. They were tampering with the ball, I think it was, something like that. And they got caught in the act. The video camera was showing it. These careers, I don't even know the names, but the careers were completely destroyed, obviously. They will not go anywhere anymore. It's over for them. There is something in humanity that, whether we like it or not, tries to take advantage over other people. It's called sin. Unrighteousness. What about this example? I'm going to give you another example. Because obviously this passage also refers to homosexuality. One of those topics that a preacher usually does not want to touch. Does not want to touch because it's just too polemical. But okay, let's just talk a little bit about it. Who heard the story of the Australian rugby player Israel Folau? That was making some very interesting comments on Instagram about gay people. Who heard about that? Yes? He said it something like this. What is God's plan for gay people? Now, that wasn't really a question because he already gave the answer in his following post on Instagram. He said like this. Hell. Now, obviously, the Rugby Association in Australia and companies and many people obviously said like, How on earth can you say such a thing? You are a bigoted, you are a homophobe, you are this, you are that. This is what we hear, right? Yeah. If you take a stand in some ways, that's what happened. Some Christians even backed him up, saying like, oh, it's so good that you're speaking out for your faith. We're so proud of you. Just read the comments. Famous people, people you know, were backing him up in that sense. And he became the judge, obviously, of gay people, saying like, they're going to hell straight away. I think it's amazing. The thing is, I'm going to come back to him very soon. But when you read Romans chapter 1, you really, really, really need to have a strong stomach to deal with it. Because if you read it through, obviously there's the part of homosexuality, but it's not just that part. It is also when you read as of verse 28, I will read the part of it. See if you can stand it, because for me, it's really slapping your face. It's like this. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, etc., etc., etc. There are 24 types of sins here. It's a little bit like pick and choose one. We are all somewhere perhaps guilty to one of them here. Now, why to pick on so much on the issue of homosexuality then? Paul, aren't you a little bit homophobic here? Intolerant? Bigoted, perhaps? Well, the issue, obviously, what Paul was trying to show here is, listen, and remember what I said. If you say no to God, it's like, I don't want to have anything to do with God, for whatever the reason is, you will exchange that relationship for something else or someone else. It's called idolatry. And Paul is basically using the example of homosexuality and lesbianism as an example to show, listen, it was made this way to be united as one, to reflect purity, to reflect God's glory, and it was exchanged for something else. Now, I am not the one that's going to judge these people. Just for you to understand where I'm coming from, because people might be thinking like, Patrick, why are you taking this? I'm not liking this. Just hear me out here. When I was a teenager myself, with an absent dad and a mom that was trying to tell me everything all the time, which also led, obviously, to me leaving home. When I was about 15 or 16 years old, I also started wondering, like, who am I really? What's my identity? A lot of teenagers have that. And there was one friend, his name is Peter, and he was somebody that I knew that he used to have a girlfriend, but in those days he broke up and started having a relationship with a man. But he was still my friend. He was a very dear friend of mine. We were having those conversations. It didn't take very long. Eventually, he broke up. It didn't go anywhere. And this Peter, he said, like, you know what? I need to show you some things. I said, like, okay. He brought me to a gay bar in Rotterdam to show me. And I didn't know about anything. I was still trying to figure out who I was. And when people are experimenting things, trying to figure out who they are. And I did. And I went to that place, and I saw very normal people. People like you and me. Obviously, there was brokenness, like you will see anywhere in the world. But that's what I saw. I will be really not the first person to say, oh, I'm judging all these people just because they have a certain orientation that I don't have myself. I will even put something on top of this. I went to Bible college, because of whom? Now, you don't know, obviously. I went to Bible college because of the advice of a gay person. Somebody that we also like, oh, what is he doing here in our midst? No. He was somebody that was already going from a heterosexual relationship to I'm not feeling comfortable with this. I'm going to another type of relationship. And he was my friend as well. Why? Why could I be his friend? Very simply. It's because in my mind, at least, I'm not making this scale of sins, like, oh, homosexuality, this is really, you're top of the food chain, or you're really rude, so that's really bad. And when you're gossiping around, well, that's not so bad. That's somewhere here. If I read the list of Paul correctly, just go through it. Disobedient to parents. You know that people nowadays, they look at that and say like, oh, that's, teenagers, they go through a phase and they talk as if it's okay. Not a problem there. But he's putting that in the same list. It's all equal. What about gossiping? I already said it. A lot of churches, they split up because of gossiping that's going on. Did you know that? People's reputations are being destroyed. Sometimes the pastor, sometimes the leader, whoever it is. Paul puts it all equal, saying like, listen up. All people are guilty. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Now you may think like, whoa, Patrick, this is really, really strong. What are you talking about? Remember that I was talking that we were in a courtroom and I was prosecutor Paul? Now all the people in the room, they are listening and the defendants already see it coming and Judge Stevens is going to plead what? Guilty. Guilty as charged. It's over. But there is one group in the room that is looking with self-righteous smiles a little bit like, yeah, you see, yeah, he's a gay, of course, you should send him to hell. That's where he belongs, right? It's very strong language that I'm using here, but I'm doing it deliberately for you to understand this. Now, prosecutor Paul is basically done with his argument, and the Judge Stevens is about to give his verdict. But before Judge Stevens wants to give his verdict, he says, anybody want to say anything? And then all of a sudden, prosecutor Paul says this, wait a second, I want to say something. And he turns to the jury. He turns to the jury. Just imagine if you're in court of law. He turns to the jury and says this. You can read it in chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. Just listen to me. Therefore you are inexcusable, O men, whoever you are who judge, for in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things. But we know that the judgment of God is according to truth against those who practice such things. And do you think this, O man, you who judge those practicing such things and doing the same, that you will escape the judgment of God? Outrageous. It's not just the defendants that are now on the, needing to plead guilty. All of a sudden it's now also the jury, those who are judging. I will continue this lawsuit, and I'm going to call a couple of witnesses to the stand. So you can imagine that Judge Stevens is coming in, and they're like, all right, the Honorable Judge Stevens is presiding, and then Prosecutor Paul says, I am calling Mrs. Magdalene to the stand. So Mrs. Magdalene is coming. Magdalene. How are you doing, Magdalene? Thank you. Come here, please. Come here, Magdalene. Isn't she a pretty sight? Yes. Thank you, Magdalene. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mrs. Magdalene used to be somebody from the streets. Somebody that wasn't proud of what she was doing, obviously. But she met somebody, a very special person. Somebody that was talking about love, about forgiveness, about change of heart, and all of these things. She was in bondage, and this person came, you obviously know who I'm talking about, and set her free. And Mary Magdalene, she said like, oh, I want to follow you. You're so awesome. You're so loving. I love you so much. Jesus went. He wasn't there anymore. Mary Magdalene continued her life until she met some of the jurors, some people from the jury. And those Jews were looking at Mary Magdalene and said like, you're still that person from the street, right? You're no good. You're a woman. Oh, you see what they're doing. You see what they're doing. They're despising her completely. Like, oh, probably pretty soon you're going back to the streets again. And all of that stuff. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to read a verse for you. Verse 4. And this he is saying to the jury, okay? Or do you despise, I'm talking to the Jews, the riches of his goodness, forbearance and long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leads you to repentance? What led Mary Magdalene to repentance was not God's judgment saying like, oh, look at what you're doing wrong. It was God's goodness, his patience, his kindness. But the Jews that were also blessed by God and received the law and everything were looking at that scene and like, guilty, 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 judge, judge, judge. Is that going anywhere? So you can imagine people are sitting in the courtroom already looking at the jurors with very different eyes. The jurors were very offended. Remember, they were Jews. Do you think they would accept the testimony of a woman from the street? No. Then prosecutor Paul said, okay, I'm going to call my next witness to the stand. I'm going to call Mr. Kerr to the stand. Mr. Kerr. Can we have an applause for Mr. Kerr? Yes, thank you very much for Mr. Kerr. Where is he going with all of this, right? Oh my goodness. Mr. Kerr is a lawyer, and he cares a lot about himself. I'm sorry. Now, Mr. Kerr, the lawyer, he was sought by some of the jurors a couple of years ago. Make sense? They also had some sort of legal issue going on. And Mr. Kerr was looking at his agenda. And he said, like, okay, let's try to meet up to have a first conversation about seeing if I can take on your lawsuit. Let's have a look. Okay, my agenda is very full. Can we do it at Friday at, let's say, 5:30? Now, these Jewish people were saying, Friday at 5:30? We're not going to do Friday at 5:30. Because half an hour later, we are celebrating the Sabbath. And when it's the Sabbath, what do? We rest. So Mr. Kerr is already looking, a bit judgmental, these people. Like they try to really make me feel bad and stuff. In fact, it's like these jurors all of a sudden said to him, like, don't you rest yourself? You look like a wreck, Mr. Kerr. Don't you need to rest a little bit yourself as well? Obviously, these people didn't become his clients. Later on, he found through a friend that actually these people weren't going to celebrate the Sabbath at 6 p.m., but they were going to another lawyer because they didn't like the lawyer because he was a Gentile. They weren't really keeping the Sabbath. They were judging Mr. Kerr. Now, Mr. Kerr, as his name implies, cares. He cares about his job, but he also cares about his family. So he knows that sometimes he's working, all-nighters or working way too much. Till one point, his conscience starts to kick in and say, like, I have a wife and 3 kids at home. Maybe, I should do a little bit less. Maybe I should work a little bit less. And he decided that week to start working a lot less, to spend quality time with his wife and his children. His conscience started to say something to him. Thank you very much. I am going to read the second part for you, because it's sometimes easy for people to misunderstand this part. But if you read it, it will start making sense a lot. I'm reading from Romans chapter 2, verses 12 to 16, and it goes like this. For as many have sinned without the law will also perish without law. And as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. For when Gentiles, think of Mr. Law, who do not have the law, by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them, in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, according to my gospel. Put in very simple English, Mr. Law has a conscience. He knows what is right and what is wrong. Doesn't always mean that he follows it, but he knows what is right and wrong. Do you need to tell Mr. Care that he's working too much? Like, oh, well, you know what? I need some love. Let's cheat on my wife. Do you think that Mr. Care will not understand that that's the wrong thing to do? Of course he knows that. And why does he know that? It's because God put the law, the thing what is right and what from wrong, he put it in our hearts. You don't need to tell a person when you're standing in line to get your burger at Hungry Jack's, and all of a sudden you cut the line. It's like, hey, you're cutting the line. If anything goes and everybody's going to do their own way, why would you say that is wrong? Because you would care about the other person, right? That's why it's wrong. Now I'm going to call, and Judge Stevens is getting hungry. He's already looking at the time. It's like, oh, this is going to take longer than I thought. I thought, the defendants would have been guilty already in prison by now. What am I going to do? He is calling another witness to the stand. And this time around, it's a Greek person. Now, Jews, they looked at Greek people like as if they were dogs. That was a very bad way of saying, like, you're scum. You're not worth anything. So I'm going to call Mr. Gentilos to the stand. Where is Mr. Gentilos? Mr. Gentilos. All right, Mr. Gentilos. Mr. Gentilos, the Greek. I could have called in another Greek, obviously, here. And Mr. Gentilos, the Greek, he has a restaurant. He has a restaurant. He got himself a little bit into trouble with ITO, the Israeli tax office, because he was cheating on his taxes a little bit. But then he said, like, that's human. Everybody does that a little bit. They say that in Greece that is a very popular hobby, right? I don't know. I see Effie already looking like, oh my goodness, Pastor, how can you say that? Anyways, he is back on track. He paid off his dues, his debts and everything. And he's sitting in his own restaurant. And some of the jurors, it's break time. Obviously, the process is going on for a longer period of time. They're sitting in that restaurant and they're bragging to each other about how they were ripping off in some business deals a couple of weeks ago some of the defendants that were, that were guilty. They were talking really, really nasty things about it. Like, remember that day? Remember the day when this guy was trying to, buy some things? Well, we sold him really, much, much more expensive than the thing that car is really worth. And more jurors start to come into the restaurant. It's still the interval. They're waiting for the lawsuit to continue. And they're doing all the same things. In fact, they all look at they're talking about the defendants. It's like, oh, these defendants, poor defendants, they're a bunch of criminals. They're a bunch of dogs. They're bad people. They should go to jail anyway. But what were they doing themselves? They were doing just as bad as the defendants themselves. And Mr. Gentilos, although he messed up big time in his life, he overheard that conversation. When he heard of the trial, he called the office of Prosecutor Paul right away. He's like, listen, I need to tell you a story. And obviously, he told the story. Thank you very much. Your embarrassment is over, I suppose. But yes. I'm going to read you another story. In verse 17 to 24, I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can read that Paul is now saying, listen, Jews, you're saying one thing, but you're doing another thing. And because of that, the people around the world, they look at you and they're like, I don't want to have anything to do with you guys because you are a bunch of hypocrites. Exactly. If you read it, particularly in verse 23 and 24, you who make you boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written. Start making sense now, what you're reading here? Judge Stevens is really, really hungry by now. He's like, let's get it done with. Paul, do you have any more witnesses? He said, yeah, I have one last witness. It's Dr. C, and he's a physician. So Dr. C, he calls him to the stand. It's like, okay, can you please raise your hands? Put your hand on the Bible. All right. Do you swear to tell the truth, nothing but the truth, not the truth, so help you God?
I do.
All right, very good. Now, he's a physician. And he knows some of the jurors over there. Actually, one of the few ones that thought like, well, I'm still okay with all of that stuff. It does not apply to me. But he said, like, you see those two jurors over there? They used to be my clients. Now, obviously, I cannot disclose all kind of things about my clients. I would violate, Oh, you're so good. You're so good. But let me tell you one thing that I can say, because this was off record. It was, not official. As I was examining these jurors, I noticed that they had something very interesting with this part of their body. It's like they were chopped off little parts that the Jews usually do. And I, as a doctor, was looking at it and it's like, okay, interesting. What is that all about? But he didn't dare to ask. Time went by. We're not his clients anymore. He bumps into his clients. They're not his clients anymore. And he's like, hey, listen, doctor, last time we spoke, I saw you looking, and let me spare you the details. You know what it is about? It's like, well, I guess it's about circumcision. The cutting of the flesh as part of your religion. It's like, yes. We are proud to be part of the Jewish religion. In fact, we know that we are part of his covenant and we are going to heaven. Whereas you, Dr. C, you're a filthy Gentile that is going straight to heaven. To hell. Have a nice day. You know what Dr. C all of a sudden said? He said, like, let me just ask you one thing. I don't know the names of the jurors. He looked at it like, doesn't your religion say, look at this, doesn't your religion say that you should love your God with everything you've got? And your neighbor as yourself? I read that in one of your scriptures somewhere. Now the Jewish jurors, they looked at him and they were silenced with that one-liner. What are they going to say now? Thank you very much. Last witness. Remember the story I told you about Israel Folau? The rugby player? Did he have the right to call out gay people the way he did? He didn't. He may have a personal opinion about, what he reads in the Bible. We all get that. But it's a very different thing to become the judge of where these people are going to. That's not our job to do. At all. That's not our job to do. And sometimes you hear in Christian circles saying like this, well, you know what? We love the sinner, but we hate the sin. And that is obviously true. But unconsciously, they're still looking at a gay person as if it is a piece of garbage. And I'm not accusing anybody here. I'm not saying that. It's not my point to judge anybody here, nor the people that I'm talking about. But what I am saying is that we need to understand what our role is in this whole process and why Paul is saying all of this. Now, before Judge Stevens comes to the final verdict, obviously it is pandemonium in the court of Rome, right? It's like, have you ever heard of a lawsuit where both the defendants and the jury were condemned? I've never heard of that. Well, this lawsuit is that crazy. And just before Judge Stevens, puts his hammer and is like, guilty as charged, one Jew stands up. And he says to Judge Stevens and to Prosecutor Paul very angrily, well, if it doesn't matter that you're a Jew because God looks at everybody as if they're equal, what is then the point of being a Jew? You can read it in chapter 3 of Romans. And Paul says this, well, you're trying to make an excuse here. God revealed his law and his will to the Jews, first of all. So it is very important and it's very special to be a Jew. But God will not judge them with a very different standard. You're mixing up things here, mister. At which point, somebody from the room that was listening, and that also felt condemned, obviously, because of everything that Prosecutor Paul was saying, So like, listen up. If these Jewish scumbags, if they are so unrighteous and living as hypocrites, then why would I go to church and why would I believe in that God anyway? You know, if they are hypocrites, it's because God is a hypocrite and they're angry. How often do you hear that comment? That they look at religion in terms of, well, you know, his followers are not the real deal, so probably God is also not the real deal. Paul said it like this, listen up. People can get it wrong and not follow God and even become hypocrites in some ways. But don't throw that in the face of God as if God is the problem here. The problem is not God, the problem is our sinful nature, our sinful heart. Finally, the last person that stands up, and this one is really, really interesting. A tattooed guy, big beard, has a little bit of an alcohol smell, you know, like around him, with his girlfriend sitting next to me. Is like, oh, that's not fair. What the blank are you saying? You're saying that Paul, you're such a hypocrite. You know what you're saying? You're saying that because of our sins, God is looking better? That He's looking more righteous? You can read it again in chapter 3. It's the third one. The third objection, an excuse that somebody is making. Why is God judging them at all? I mean, when we sin, it makes God look really good. Can't God just leave me alone? I'll leave God alone. He leaves me alone. We're all in peace. I hear people saying that sometimes. If we leave evil just go unchecked, I think that's a bad idea. God is still a righteous God, a just God, a loving Father, but a just God at the same time. Time is up. It's 5 o'clock, and Judge Stevens finally gave his verdict. Everybody in the room is guilty as charged. The jury, they were self-righteous. They thought they had it. They were okay. They had a special relationship with God because they had the law, but they weren't obeying it. You can read it in Romans chapter 2, towards the end. They were circumcised. They had the law, but they weren't obeying it. They weren't doing it. And because of that, unbelievers, they were looking at the church. Let's translate it now to what it is today. And it's like, I don't want to have anything to do with that God. But the problem is, people still try to figure out what is right from wrong in their own terms. And just look around in Australia. Or just look around anywhere in the world. We talked about Syria, but other places. It's getting very dark out there. And when people think that they can just figure it out on their own terms, why do you think this is going to lead up to? Still, it is not our job as Christians to judge these people. That's only God's job to do. It's not our job to be like Prosecutor Paul, imputing sins and unrighteousness all the time, throwing it into the face of everybody and everyone. That's not our job either. You know what our job is? What do you think? Love. Our job is to love, and in fact, to be a testimony. When people start, and I say this so many times here in the room, when people start looking at you and say, like, wait a second, this is a different testimony. I see that there's something different in his eyes. He loves me just for who I am. You know what's going to happen? You know who is going to do the prosecuting part, the convicting part? We have an agent for that. We call him the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit convinces people, like, listen up, I think you should give up on that. That's not my job to do. That's not your job to do. That's the Holy Spirit's part to do. And when they see something different in you and in me, they know, like, wait a second, what that person has, I want it as well. That's our part. I'm going to finish. We cannot change ourselves. The good news is not about trying to better yourself in 7 steps. We can't do it. We are not the judge of others. We can't. That's not our job either. It is true that there is a final judgment coming. For some people, that's irrelevant. They think like, whatever. There is no God, so I don't need to care about that either. But His Word says that there is a final judgment coming. God is very patient with people. It is His goodness that leads people to what? To repentance. It's His goodness. It's not His judgment. God does not want to judge. Eventually He will have to judge. Because remember about when I was telling the story when I got beat up really, really bad? If this judge, Stevens, would have said, well, too bad for you, Patrick, but I'm going to let him go. Would I have had justice? Obviously not. You understand? Next week, Shanini is going to talk about this. How a loving God at the same time can be a just God. Because that's the dilemma here. As we are going to stand, and I would like to